So there's this phrase that I've been thinking about, which is expectation collapse. And this is something that happens to us in midlife a lot of times. And I want to talk about this, but I also want to clarify some things because expectation collapse is not the same thing as burnout. It is not the same thing as failure. So I'm going to kind of define those three so that we know the difference. But if you're new here, my name is Janet, and welcome to the Second Act Collective. So let's jump into this. So what is expectation collapse? And I'm actually going to kind of read the definition so that we know exactly the difference of this, between expectation collapse, burnout, and failure. So expectation collapse is more of when the things that you thought or believed to be true, or maybe what you had like assumptions about something, turn out to be very different from the reality of what you're experiencing. So there's this gap that happens where what you expected, what you thought things were going to look like, and this can be in life, in business, in relationships. It happens in all areas, even with our social construct, the social systems that we have. Sometimes we have assumptions of how we think things are going to go. We have assumptions about what our lives will turn out to be, or careers, or relationships. And then when you're in it, once you actually get to leave this reality, the reality might be very different from what you expected or what you thought is what was going to be. So that gap, the gap between what you believe to be true and what things turn out to be, is what we call the expectation collapse. So here's the difference with what burnout is. So burnout is about energy systems breaking down. So this is about depletion of your energy, where the demand on you, is exceeding what your capacity is. That's really what causes burnout, is that there's a demand on you and you are not able physically, emotionally, mentally, you don't have the capacity for that demand. And so that strain, that strain that you have between what is demanded of you and what you have the capacity for causes exhaustion, causes emotional detachment, causes a lot of things. And that's what burnout does. So burnout is more about the energy systems and how that can be depleted in your life. And, and you end up with burnout. Failure, on the other hand, is more about execution breakdowns, right? So failure is that it's really result-based on, outcome. So you had a goal and you didn't finish, you didn't complete it, or you were not able to achieve it. You had a strategy and it didn't work. You had a decision that ended up causing more problems or even giving you undesired results. So that's what failure is. So failure is a lot to do with the efforts that was put in, a lot to do with your expectation could be reasonable. Your system could still be sound, but if the effort that is put in does not produce the results, then that's what we call failure. So I wanted to kind of differentiate that, because it helps us to know that there's a big difference between all these things, between what we sometimes call, failure, what we call burnout, what we call this expectation collapse that I'm going to talk about. So this, I think, happens a lot in midlife. And this channel is for women over 40 and beyond. So we talk a lot about the things that are happening to us in this stage of life. So this expectation collapse, I think it happens a lot in midlife, but it can also happen in your 20s. But I just feel like when you're in your late 40s going to 50s and 60s, there is an awareness about a lot of these things. So there are different kinds of expectation collapse that happen. So we have what I call the private collapse, right? So what are these? So these are things that are happening inside your body, inside your home, inside very intimate relationships or relationships with friends and family. So these are more private. They're not something that's, everybody's going to know. They're not something that everybody can notice. So let's talk about what can happen in a marriage or what can happen in a friendship, right? So you go into this friendship or marriage with certain expectations. Anyone who's been married, we know what this is like. Where you go into, you have certain expectation. And I think a lot of times in relationships, these expectations are not talked about, right? So we don't talk about these things before we get into the relationship. And yet you have your expectations, your spouse has expectation. And then once you're in that marriage, you realize, oh, what I thought it was going to look like is not what it is. And that gap that happens between what you expected the marriage to be or what you expected the friendship to be and what you're actually living through, the reality of what you have is very different. There's a very big gap between the two. And so this causes, of course, emotional stuff. You have emotional pain, you have a lot of disappointment, you have all these things. And also something else I want to talk about is that disappointment is not necessarily the same as, is this emotion, expectation collapse we're talking about. The expectation collapse does cause disappointment, but it's not the same thing as well. So you go through all these emotional things that you go through after you realize, oh, the reality you're living is not what you thought it was going to be. And that gap is what we call expectation collapse. And people can live in relationship. You can be in a marriage, you can be in a friendship where things are not what you want them to be, right? And you're just either surviving through this relationship or you are just there for the sake of whatever reason you're there and not really fully engaged. And therefore there's, can be bitterness, can be detachment, can be all kinds of problems that happen because we are in a place where the things we thought or believed to be true are no longer true. And that wrestling that happens, especially in relationships, is very difficult. It's very difficult to come to terms with the fact that, excuse me, what you thought things were going to be are not. And then how do you move forward? Do you go for therapy? What do you do? And those are, of course, decisions that you make depending on your situation. But these are things that happen. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the expectation were never communicated in the first place before the people engaged in this relationship. And everybody has their own thing. They're thinking it should look like this. And then when it doesn't, we are all disappointed. So another relationship, I think this happens is like if you're a mother, right? I'm a mother of 3. And the expectation, you go in and everybody tells you how wonderful motherhood is. And it is, but it's also very challenging, right? So you go in with these rosy cheeks of what you think is going to be. There's going to be roses and this and this. And then you're in it and you realize it is really hard work. Being a mom, I think, is one of the hardest things that anyone can do. I might believe, I think mothers should be paid, I don't know how much, but it is a very difficult thing. As much as you get a lot of joy and it's fulfilling and you're happy, and there's another part that is also very difficult, right? So you have these children that you're also raising, and your expectation sometimes that you think, and I think a lot of older women is that getting older and their children are leaving to start their own lives. This can be an issue where you thought maybe you're gonna still be close with your kids, you're gonna still spend some time with them, and then things, and they have their own lives, they have their own spouses, and they have their own family, and things are not what you thought. So again, that gap of going into this thing, I'm going to be a mom, and what you expect it to be and what it turns out to be are two different things, right? You might have, like a lot of us, when we first have kids, you think it's going to be easy. I mean, people tell you that it's not, it's hard sometimes, but I think we just don't believe how hard it is. And so we are in it, the sleepless nights, the emotional load, all the stuff that you have to carry as a mom. Nobody tells you about this. And I even think maybe it's a good thing that nobody does, because I think then people would not want to have kids, because it can be very hard. So we have all those things that are happening where we as mothers give so much of ourselves, and there is maybe some expectation as we're getting older that we're going to get something in return, and not necessarily attention, not just something, and sometimes you don't even know what that something is. And then when you get to that place where the children have left the house and you don't get that whatever it is you expected, there is some disappointment. There is that, again, the the emotional, I don't know, there's a lot of pain sometimes that come with it, a lot of disappointments, a lot of looking at your life, because this role that you had is no longer there, right? This role that you played in somebody else's life is no longer as important as it used to be. And then, the questions is, who am I without this? Who am I? And a lot of mothers go through all that. And it is the difference in the expectations that we have. That is the collapse that is happening, in our own private lives, in our own, hearts and minds. And sometimes you can't even share that with people because it's so private, right? And you don't know, you don't want to look like you're a bad mother, or you don't want to look like you're whatever. But people are going through this, right? And another one, I want to touch on the friendship one, because one thing that I've realized, talking to women and coaching women is, especially in this midlife, is how there's a lot of friendship, a lot of people who are struggling to have friends. And I think especially for a lot of times for women who have kids who have left the house, and now maybe your friendships were not so strong, and now you're trying to re-engage and make new friends, and that can be difficult for people who are single, who never married, who never had kids. It can be very hard as you get older to get into friendship. So there are all these dynamics that are happening in our private lives, is we're in midlife, as women in midlife, where you're struggling to have friends, you're struggling to make connections, and to even maybe some of the friendships that you have already, kind of cooled down in some way, because you just were in different seasons and doing different things. So all those things, if you they kind of compound, and if you combine all that, it becomes a lot of disappointments, a lot of things that we thought were going to be, like their friendships, maybe you thought were going to be a longer, that you're going to be friends with this person for a long time, and then there's a fallout, or maybe they just get busy, you get busy, and you kind of you're not close together anymore, as close as you used to be. That in itself, can be, when you look back, you're in your midlife and you realize, I don't have as many friends, or maybe I don't have as many close friends. And you just, that's not what you thought you were going to be in your 20s. You didn't think all these relationships were either going to fall apart, or you're going to end up trying to make friends when you're in your 40s or 50s. And these are things that are happening, right? These are the private collapses that are happening in our lives. And then comes another one, which is about the physical reality of what happens in midlife, which I think impacts women, of course, because I'm talking to you, yeah, a woman. If you're a man, that's okay too. But all this physical stuff that happens as we're getting into midlife. We talk a lot about the fact that there's the premenopausal stuff that can start happening in your 40s or early 50s. There's menopause that happens later, in your 50s or 60s, just depends with your body. But we have all these changes that are happening that, first and foremost, we're never told kind of to expect. I mean, you kind of hear people talk about all this stuff, like the menopause and the hot flashes and this. And I think when you're in your 20s and 30s, you don't really pay attention to that as much, because you are young and you are, but there's a lot of body things that are changes that are happening, and your body's doesn't want to cooperate. It doesn't want to lose that 10 pounds around your waist that I've been struggling with. What you thought you were going to be or look like in your 50s, and what you actually look like can be, can be again another gap. What your expectations was in terms of even your health and how healthy you're going to be, and all these things that you believe yourself that you're going to be, and where you are, the reality of what you actually look like, how you feel, that gap again, is the expectation collapse we go through. And it is disappointing. It can get people into depression. It can get you into just a place where you're not okay because of this. And these are realities that are happening. And also, I think because, especially these private collapses that are happening to us, we are not really free to talk about that to a lot of people, and even to our friends. And a lot of times, if we are also struggling with finding friendships during this time in our midlife, then it's even more difficult, and it can feel very lonely. I think the thing about the collapses that happen, the private collapses that happen to us in midlife, are very much I don't know, they affect you in such a way that you can be very lonely. You can feel like you're alone. You can feel like you're the only one going through this. You can feel like, oh, it seems like everybody looks good out there. Everybody looks like they're doing it and you're doing it well. And why am I the one struggling? Like, it can get you into this spiral of just, oh, what's wrong with me? Why can't I handle this? Everybody else seems to be doing well. What is wrong with me? Right? And that's not what we want. That's not what I want for you or for myself. That's why we have this kind of discussions, that these things happen and they're not happening just to you. They're happening to a lot of women who are in this stage of life, in this second act of life. And it's okay. And it's something that we can be honest about to ourselves and honest to our loved ones and to our friends. So the next thing I want to cover is the social collapses, the expectation collapse that happens in our social environment. So your career, your business, right? So you might have started a career path with the expectation that, maybe by when I'm done, I'll be able to retire, or maybe I'll be able to have money to travel, right? Those are kind of the expectation you go into. Or by then I would have saved enough money, I've done some investments, and I'll be able to live a certain lifestyle. And what can happen a lot of times to a lot of people is that maybe their savings or whatever investments didn't, something happens to the economy and things fall apart and that money is lost. Maybe the career that you had, you get fired, or maybe you lose your your pension or a retirement fund, whatever it is that you kind of had hoped on, is in, this is where you're going to go. This is how much you're going to have and the things that you're going to do. And now you find yourself, the reality that you're facing is not what you planned for. You've put in 20, 30, 40 years into this career, and things have not turned out the way that you thought were going to be. And this happens to a lot of people, right? So these are social collapses that are happening, and these are things that are also happening out of your control. A lot of times you have no control on the markets, on the economy and what's happening and how that affects your investments, all these things that are happening. And then the other thing that can also happen with our careers, if I'm just starting with the career and then I'll move on to like you having a business, is that, you can be in a company where you are now a senior person, whatever, because you've been there for so long, but you find yourself again maybe being overlooked on promotions because of your age, because there are younger people that they can get for cheaper salaries. All those dynamics that can happen in when you work in corporate, that are very disappointing, that you find yourself at this age, maybe in your 60s or 70s, being overlooked, and maybe the wisdom and experience that you have is not considered worthwhile, it's not considered valuable, and you're just kind of being overlooked, while everybody else is maybe getting a promotion because they're younger, and your opinions maybe don't matter because people think you're just old and you don't know what's going on. So these are things that can happen in a career, right? So it's hard. It can be very hard. And then let's talk about if you're starting a new business, or if you have had a business. So in starting a new business, we go in a lot of times, especially, and I have another video that I talked about starting a business in midlife. Especially in midlife, you can be starting a new career, a new business. And what you maybe your expectation is that I'm gonna be at a certain place in maybe a year or two, things are gonna be this way. You go in with some assumptions of how maybe the business is gonna turn out. And nothing wrong with that, right? Because we want to be positive when we're doing this. We, of course, don't want to go in with a bloom or just gloom and doom. No, but we can go in with certain expectations that we have on how things are going to work. And then once you do start the business, especially if you don't start your business the right way, the reality can be very different, from what you thought it was going to be. And you might not be making as much money. You might have to work harder than you thought. And this is, again, there's a gap between what you thought things were going to be and what the reality is. And even as women, especially, we have the issue of support. You're starting something, pivoting into a new business, a new career, and maybe you thought you were going to have support. And this is a big thing because for us most of us are primary caregivers of our family members, the aging parents, the young kids, the ones in college or young adults, wherever you are in that, frame. You might be thinking you're going to have support and then you don't. Then you realize, no, I actually have to do this on my own. I actually have to balance all this by myself. And there's just not a lot of support. Right? So we are having that collapse happening in our careers. We're having collapses happening in our businesses because of the assumptions that we have. And not that having those assumptions was ever wrong, because a lot of times they're based on things that we've seen, that are kind of, things that you should expect. But when things happen in life that then makes those beliefs, they just shatter your beliefs. They just shatter everything that you once stood on or believed. It is very devastating. And that collapse is not, sometimes it's very hard to get out of there, to climb out of that and start over and do something else. I think I touched on the community and friendship, right? That our expectation is we're getting older, we're going to have more lasting friendships. We're going to have a community, which is very important, and which is why I have a community that you can join. It's in the description, for women, because we sometimes lack the community. We lack the support to have this kind of discussions, to have people you can become friends with, you can do things with, because as we're getting older, in the family, the kids are living, maybe the relationships are breaking down, or whatever is happening. People are passing away, all kinds of stuff is happening. Parents are aging and passing on. We are left standing with no community, with no support. So we all need that. We all need community, right? All of us do. For us to even function well in society, we need community. So you grow up thinking, yeah, I'm going to have lasting friendships. I'm going to make new friends and be able to have my people. And then you realize in midlife it's very hard to make new friends. And at the same time, you're going through the fact that your old friendships might have kind of, out of season, as in maybe people have moved on and you have become different people. And you're dealing with all this stuff. You just not finding a community that you can be part of. You're not finding women that you can be part of a friend group. And the struggle is real. There is a reality there that is real and that is painful, that is lonely, that is difficult. So when these social things collapse in our lives, so we have the private, we talk about the social ones. It's just, kind of things are just adding up in your life that you have to face, that you have to come to grips with and to deal with, and then move on and see what you can do, right? And that's why this community is here, so that you can help each other through all these things by first and foremost acknowledging that these collapses are happening in our lives. And, they are not easy. But when you do have people around you who understand, who are open about these things, it makes it easier to walk through this part of our journey. And the last part I want to talk about is the structural collapses that happen. And these are more to do with the system, like a national in a country, right? And I'll give you an example. So, as a citizen of a country, you, like in America where I live, people expect that when they retire, they will have the social security for retirement, for money to use as they are aging, right? But we have collapses in our country where these systems are not working, they're breaking down. So there's not maybe as much money for social security or retirement fund as you might have expected, depending on where you are. These are collapses that are happening on a national level, right? Or maybe the political situation, you thought, as you're growing up, things were going to be a certain way, and things have radically changed, that you don't even recognize your own country anymore. So this is another expectation collapse that is happening to a lot of people in this on a national level. And you are caught in that, right? So you and I are caught in what is happening in the economy that we live in the country that we live in, even the belief system of the country that we live in, when things are changing so much and you're just caught off guard, like what is happening here? Because you believe that this country and its beliefs were a certain way and now things are changing. And that is, devastating. And the cultural belonging that you have, the belonging you had to this place, to this country, can start to get fractured. And you're left with, I don't know. I don't know what to do. I don't know what's going on. And there's a lot of confusion. Of course, there's a lot of disappointment. There's a lot of bitterness, all those things. And this is a national level of like expectation collapsing for everyone in a country. And I want to just talk about, what is now termed, I think they call it the cultural, the third culture, where you have left your country of origin, like I did 25 years ago, moved somewhere else, and then you neither belong to your old place where you came from, and you also don't feel like you belong to the new place. And I was listening to someone talk about this, and I thought that is so true. That if you leave your country of origin and go somewhere else, and then even leave that other second place to go somewhere to live somewhere else, you have become more like a citizen of the world. But at the same time, you don't feel like you culturally belong to anyone to any country anymore, because you are like a mishmash of everything, which I think is good, because you kind of get, you have a more broad way of thinking. The more you're exposed to different cultures, the more I feel like the more your critical thinking changes, the way you look at life changes, just that exposure. But what happens to you is then the cultural belonging that everybody kind of wants starts to, sip away, start to feel like it's being erased, because you don't belong to where you came from, where you were born, maybe because you've been gone for so long. And the new place that you're at, or that you moved to, or the different places that you've been, different countries that you've lived in, you don't feel like you belong there either, because you were not born there, so, and you didn't grow up there. So you can be caught in this again, a feeling of just lacking that cultural belonging, because you neither belong to one place or the other. Yeah, again, like a citizen of the world. And that can just, of course, cause some emotional disorientation if you're not aware. And I didn't even know there was a term called the third culture, but I'm like, that is so true. Where you don't fit in where your place of origin, you don't actually fit in as much into the new place, and you're just emotionally caught in between the countries that you've been. And putting a name to it helps, because it makes you understand how exactly you feel. And that is actually normal. People feel this, and it's okay. If you're someone who's traveled and lived in different countries, you can tend to have this. So when we're talking on the structural collapses, that's when institutions are failing. The things that you thought you were going to get are not what you get. That's where you move to a place and the expectations you had about that new place are not really what the reality is. And there's a lot of emotional collapse. And you hear about people, I hear about people who like move to Europe, Americans who are moving to Europe, and how sometimes they're back within 5 years because they couldn't just stand like at a difficult time being there. And I think that is again, it's an expectation collapse that is happening with these people that are moving to different places, especially if you're moving when you're older and you've had you're so used to your life, right? All right. And American life is very comfortable. It can make you just you get used to the easiness of things, of how the country operates. And with that, you can then have a problem if you go somewhere else because certain things are not as fast, certain things are not, the way you're used to. And people struggle with this. And I think a lot of Americans struggle with this. And because they go with some expectation when they visit these new countries or think they're going to move to that new country, they have all this expectation. And because they are also older, so they are kind of dug in their heels in what they want, what they don't want. They're not willing to change a lot of times because I think if you're going to move to a different country, there has to be a flexibility with it. You have to be someone who's flexible enough to integrate into a community and to learn the language, to learn the culture, to assimilate. So, but it's very hard, I think, because when I moved for myself, I was younger. But I think it's hard for people when they are older to do this. And that's why you find, that a lot of the old Americans moving to Europe coming back because they just can't handle the situation because their expectation and their reality, the gap is just too much for them to bear. And so this happens when I say every area of our life, it happens. And people end up quitting, people end up giving up because they are not aware that there is the gap. There is something called the expectation collapse that's going to happen to you in whatever area, and you will find it in one area in your life, if not a lot of them. And us just being prepared for that, going in. And sometimes it helps to, if you're doing something, to go in with very low expectations because the high expectations you have, sometimes the fall back to reality can be even more devastating because if you have such high expectations and then the reality is so different, the disappointment is devastating yourself that you can't even handle it and you're like, I think I'm done. I just can't do this. So what do we do then with all this to avoid the expectation collapses that can happen in our lives? I think it's first and foremost to go in a situation or a relationship, or whether it's a career, a business, trying to be as realistic as possible so that your expectations are closer to what the reality will be, right? So that you don't go with such high expectation that you get, plummeted down when the reality is not what you thought it was going to be. So having that, a more realistic approach to things, and also being flexible in our expectation, realizing, oh yeah, this is what I thought it was going to be, but it's not. And being someone who can adjust, who can be flexible enough to make the changes that are needed. You can acknowledge that, yeah, my expectations were this and this, but this is not the reality. So how do I move forward? What do I do? What do I need to do? How do I make the changes? How do I change myself? And how do I make the changes around me so that I can move forward? Because we are not looking to be stuck in the collapse, right? We are not victims, not victims of situations. We are not looking to be stuck. So we have to find ways to bridge that gap between the expectations and the reality, and to move to somehow find a place we can live that is in between, where things did not turn out to be the way they are, right? And things are, the reality is not, maybe not so good, but I believe your attitude matters. Your attitude and how you look at life matters for you to be able to manage this, because the collapse is there in every area, like I said. So you have to have an attitude of someone who can adjust, who can adapt to different situations and make the best out of it. And I think as people in midlife, even though sometimes we can be hard and set on our ways, if you're that type of person, you know, I think there's some wisdom that we have at this stage of our lives that can help us to be able to walk that line, that to be able to live in that gap of the expectation collapse that we might find ourselves in, and get out of it and climb out of it and live a life that is full, live a life that is full of gratitude, live a life that is full of joy by you choosing to just walk in that joy. So this is what I had to share with you. I have a meeting today. I have to do a presentation. And so, but I wanted to just share with you before I jump on that today. And kind of, because I've been thinking about this phrase, the expectation collapse, and just looking at my own life and the things that I felt had collapsed around me. And I think just having that phrase has helped me realize, yeah, there was a lot of expectation collapse that has happened in different areas. And, some of them I'm working through them, some of them I've moved past. And so wherever you are, I think putting names and naming things helps, putting definitions to stuff helps us to process things and to be able to overcome the things that we're in. Again, if you're new here, my name is Janet, and I would love for you to subscribe and also join our community that is in the description down below. And join our community, and I look forward to you, to us talking about all these things. So go ahead and subscribe, share with your friends, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.